Welcome everyone to yet another Pearl specialized reading session on the Tamil struggle. My name is Abarna Selvarajah and I'll be the moderator for our session. Today, we'll be together for an hour and a half, the first hour reserved for discussions between both our guest speakers and the last 30 minutes reserved for questions and answers. Similar to our reading groups, questions can be submitted using the general chat box, which I will then pose to our guest speakers. And if you have any private questions, please feel free to message them directly to myself. Since we have two guest speakers, please indicate their initials, either S for Sinthujan or T for Thanges, or B for both. Also, due to demand, we will be recording today's session and posting it onto our YouTube page. We are dedicated to building a safer space at Pearl, and this falls in line with our safer space policy, so please be mindful of that in the comments as well. Our topic today will be the intersection of caste and the resistance. Guest speakers, one of the two that we have will be Sinthujan Varatharajah. Sinthujan Varatharajah is a political geographer, researcher, and essayist. His work focuses on spatial marginalities and geographies of power, with a particular focus on refugees, stateless people, and oppressed castes. He has previously worked as an advisor for urban inclusion of refugees for the European Commission and the Senate of Berlin, as a consultant for housing of refugees in Germany, as well as political educator across Europe. Varatharajah uses, amongst other means, social media, particularly Instagram, as a tool for public education. His most recent work, How to Move an Arch, is an exhibition as part of the 11th Berlin Biennale for Contemporary Art and narrates Tamil refugees' movements through a city divided by the Cold War. Varatharajah is of Dalit origin and has extensively written, lectured, and advocated for caste liberation from an Ulam Tamil Dalit perspective. Thank you so much for being with us today, Sinthujan. Would you like to start off with your presentation?
Thanks for the intro again. Can we talk about Tamil liberation without talking about caste liberation? I argue no, and here's why. Caste liberation is Tamil liberation, and Tamil liberation cannot be achieved without caste liberation. And for that, we need to dwell into our modern history to understand how oppressed castes have not only been part of the Tamil resistance, but at the very forefront of it. When we think of Tamil history, we mostly think of particular dates. Our historical narratives have been reduced to numbers that come with certain words, images, and feelings. Here's an example. When you think of riots and pogroms that targeted Tamils, what do you think of? And what place do you imagine for them to have occurred in? You probably think of 58, 74, 77, 81, or 83. And you probably think of Colombo, Jaffna Town, or maybe Trinco. And indeed, all of these dates are significant, and so are these places. But they only tell us part of the story. And here's where we need to do some correcting. The first documented riots that involved Tamils didn't happen in 1958. They happened 77 years before that. Not in Colombo or any other bigger Tamil settlement, but in Mavidapuram in 1871 under British colonial rule. And this wasn't the first or the last riot to occur. There were several more to follow until 1958 finally happened. But where are these acts of violence in our historical records? Almost non-existent. You ask yourself why? Well, it's pretty simple. They didn't involve Europeans or Sinhalese as perpetrators. The perpetrators were dominant caste Tamils, Vellalar Tamils. In other words, the majority of Tamil society. And this is why our history records look the way they do. The dominant caste viewpoint, the Jaffna and Colombo Vellalar viewpoint, have left us with a distorted history that looks from top down rather than bottom up. And by doing so, erases conflicting, uncomfortable histories, placing them in a tension that doesn't have to be. So let's start here. Tamil resistance was never just a response to European or Sinhalese colonialism. Resistance practices existed amongst Tamils as long as the caste system took hold of Tamil societies, which means several hundreds to thousands of years. To do what most Tamils today do, denying the existence of caste, is to then also deny the long history of resistance against caste. And this leads to an ahistorical account of what Tamil resistance is, was, and can be in the future. Anti-caste resistance reached its peak in the 20th century when it turned into a radical protest movement that was to deeply challenge the Tamil societal status quo. Caste resistance in Elam was ahead of its time in the entire region, even further than the Dalit mobilization in the then British Madras Presidency across the Park Strait. It mirrored the increasing violence imposed upon oppressed castes by predominantly Vellalars. The assertion of oppressed castes often directly led to violence against them. To be an oppressed caste member meant, and still means, to be obedient to rules and regulations of those who oppress. This wave of unceasing violence eventually led to the formation of political organizations that spearheaded the anti-caste struggle. These political formations preceded those of dominant castes that we today probably all remember: the All Sloan Tamil Congress and the Federal Party. The Forum of the Oppressed Castes was founded almost 2 decades ahead of these, in 1927, and the Northern Sloan Tamil Minority Mahasabha a year before the ACTC in 1943. But which of these organizations do you remember, or have you even ever heard of? Their cause was the fight against untouchability and for the rights of oppressed caste members within Tamil society, but also within the larger colonial state. They were the ones to lead the first disobedience and resistance campaigns within Tamil society. One of them being the 1929 campaign for equal seating and eating opportunities for oppressed caste members, particularly children in schools. But with each successful campaign, with increasing rights being granted to oppressed caste members by the colonial state, they faced more and more violence by the Tamil Vellalar-dominated society. In 1931, for instance, when universal franchise was granted by the British to all colonial subjects in Sloan, Vellalar Tamils imposed stricter caste laws in the Tamil regions. They were so inhuman that they surpassed those in parts of the British Raj and included prohibitions of carrying an umbrella, looking into the eyes of a dominant caste person, or covering their torsos. The latter is important to note when we look at how on Instagram, for instance, Vellalar Tamils abroad have come to use colonial photography depicting oppressed caste women without torso covering as a way of reclaiming. But what is being reclaimed? And what history is being erased? As you can tell, we've now shifted towards the end of British colonialism and landed within the Sinhala state. A year after the 1956 Sinhala Only Act was passed, the Prevention of Social Disability Act became law in independent Sloan. It made caste discrimination in the public realm punishable, but only with light legal consequences. This, again, was opposed by Vellalars. By now, you probably get the pattern. The law didn't prevent dominant caste from excluding oppressed caste from entering koils, tea shops, and schools. And this led to a number of disobedience campaigns led by oppressed caste members. During that same period, anti-state non-violent actions, satyagraha actions, also took place, led by dominant caste members, particularly the Federal Party under Selvarajah. They were influenced and shaped by the very resistance practices spearheaded by oppressed caste members already decades ago. But the latter remain outside of normative history, while the former have become Tamil history. Although the so-called ethnic, but rather racial question subsumed the caste question, the violence against oppressed castes continued throughout the racial conflict. It didn't spare them. And here, we need to consider an intersectional approach to understand how caste matters within a genocide, how caste matters within an exodus. For this, it is crucial to understand geography and economic capital, all of which are dictated by caste regulations. The racial conflict, in fact, affected in many ways oppressed castes more than any other. Why? Because they didn't own their own land they could return to, they didn't have networks outside of their own communities that could help them, and they didn't have the capital to leave as easily as others could. Which means the effects of casteism also had direct effects on who is more exposed and vulnerable to state violence. Oppressed castes are disproportionately more vulnerable in any conflict situation, and this is true for all of them, but particularly oppressed caste women, queer, and differently abled people. But also beyond conflict, when it comes to natural catastrophes, such as floods or droughts, they are more vulnerable than others. And as I said before, a lot of it has to do with geography and capital redistribution, all of which are dictated by caste regulations. Since caste is a social, economic, political, cultural, and geographical system of apartheid, it, for instance, decides on who is allowed to own land and where one is allowed to live, work, and die on. Caste oppression, as most other forms of oppression, is designed. It isn't a natural state of being, but rather choices made by powerful groups to willfully harm and suppress oppressed groups. Oppressed castes are thereby by design pushed to the outside of Tamil settlements, Tamil societies, and Tamil history. They are by design rendered into periphery, which also means that what happens to them matters less to the mainstream than what happens to the so-called mainstream. And the places they live in matter less than those that have come to become central in our imagination of what being Tamil means, of where Tamilness resides. When in 1983, for instance, Tamil people, homes, and shops were burned by Sinhalese mobs in Colombo and other parts of the island, Tamil plantation workers were equally affected by the racist violence. Many of them fled northbound, only to be mistreated there too. Their histories, their suffering remain almost excluded from our canon, unless we want to talk about, or rather appropriate, the 1949 Citizenship Act. While simultaneously erasing the participation of a large part of the Tamil Vellalar bourgeoisie in rendering hundreds of thousands of Tamils stateless. Another question we could ask ourselves concerning 1983 is, would 1983 have had the same effect on Tamil consciousness would it have happened somewhere in the so-called periphery, not in the center? Would it have affected in its majority not the Tamil bourgeoisie, but oppressed caste Tamils? It probably wouldn't, because oppressed caste histories, lives, and rights are pushed to the edges of our consciousness. And yet, they fought for all of our liberation. How? Although oppressed castes are the least represented in Tamil political parties, and although their causes are the least taken upon by the mainstream Tamil polity in the past and the present, they formed a large part, if not the majority of Yekpam fighters, and paid the heaviest price for Tamil liberation, for the liberation of all Tamils, even those who systematically oppressed them. Before the war genocide, during the war genocide, and beyond. Here, it's important to note that the Irkam wasn't just the result of Sinhala fascism, but it was also a direct rejection of the respectability politics practiced for decades by the Tamil Vellalar majority. The Irkam wasn't founded by Vellalars, it was founded by career men, and there's a reason for that. Although the career caste aren't an oppressed caste, they're a caste group that was numerous enough and wealthy enough, therefore strong enough to historically challenge Vellalar society with less fears of sanctions than any other non-Vellalar group could have. And this mattered, including in the LTT's approach towards caste. The LTT was born within a caste landscape that was quickly subsumed by the national liberation discourse. And the ways of how Vellalars relate to the Irkam has always been linked to caste sentiments. Back to the question, why were there so many oppressed caste members in the Irkam? Oppressed castes were least likely to be able to flee the country. They therefore faced the brunt of the Sri Lankan state's violence more than most others. And this overlaps with how they are geographically placed and how their homes have been, by way of their placement, been disproportionately more often been targets of attacks, takeovers, and destructions. As you can see, oppressed castes have for more than a century led the Tamil struggle for equality and human rights, and yet they remain written out of history. Their history is one that is wrapped in silence. Dominant caste Tamils today, including Tamil diaspora actives, have a way of writing, speaking, and portraying our history into a casteless history. They're quick to talk about race, to talk about Sinhalese and white people, while hardly ever talking about Vellalar people, about themselves. They ask themselves, why does the Sri Lankan state oppress us? But they hold themselves from asking another important question. Why are the people who are displaced the longest, who are disappeared the most, who are martyred the most, who have lost the most, always the same? Is there more to them than the Tamilness? And is there more to you than your Tamilness? Why are you here while they are there? Why are you alive while they aren't? Thank you.
Thank you for your incredibly powerful presentation, Sinthujan. I think that we've learned a lot and everyone has a lot of questions that they want to pose to you. We'd like to also introduce our second presentator for today, and his name is Thanges Paramsothy. Thanges Paramsothy received his PhD in Anthropology and Master's degree in Refugee Studies and Forced Migration from University of East London in the UK, after completing his undergraduate in Sociology at the University of Peradeniya in Sri Lanka. He taught at the University of Colombo and the University of East London. He was a visiting scholar at the Department of South Asian Studies at Cornell University. He is an independent researcher now, and his research interests include the areas of caste dynamics, conflict-induced migration, religion, Tamil diaspora, subaltern politics, land issues, and visual anthropology. Thank you for being with us, Thanges. Would you like to continue your presentation?
Many thanks for the introduction. And my presentation mostly following the Sinthujan's presentation, but he touched a historical point of view, but I would like to more contemporary caste and resistance in Jaffna. In pre-war Jaffna, oppressed caste collectively and individually fought against casteism with the support of leftist movements and political parties in order to gain equal access to education, politics, temple rituals, and other public places. The more visible resistance practice against casteism were either collective protest or open confrontation between the dominant caste and the oppressed caste. The struggle against casteism reached the zenith with the temple movement in the late 1960s. This campaign, as well as the dominant caste reaction against it, turned violence, leading to erosion and even assassination on the part of revival groups. The resistance of oppressed caste against casteism in the sphere were open and visible act collectively undertaken by these caste groups. Such collective resistance of oppressed caste was undermined with the emergence of Tamil militant movements and the rise of collective Tamil ethnic consciousness since the 1970s. The Tamil militant movements, particularly the LTT, treated casteism prevailing among Tamils as an internal issue and addressed greater threat for entire Tamil communities and their Tamil ethnic identities looming from Sri Lankan singular dominant state. The visible form of collective resistance against casteism were viewed as a threat to the unity of Tamils and their collective effort to fight against ethnic discrimination during the de facto state of Tamil Eelam. The chair indicates that the issue on caste have treated as pesa porul in Tamil language, the silent topic in Tamil language nationalist discourse. The tendency is to assert that caste was a thing that passed and Tamil Eelam will be caste free. Any open discussion on caste is seen as bringing old divisiveness back and therefore not healthy for Tamil liberation struggle. Sharon further indicates that, on the other hand, there is a tendency among Western scholars to view Tamil nationalism and the rise of Tigers purely as a caste phenomenon. These two extremes do not reflect the complex relationship between changing caste and nation interaction among Tamils. However, there are a number of instances where individuals who practice casteism in public places were punished violently by the establishment of the LTT. The LTT movement encouraged intercaste marriages, which can be viewed as act of resistance in order to challenge the rigidity of caste hierarchical division and so-called caste purity. For example, members of the LTT, including oppressed caste leaders, married with the members of different caste groups, particularly with the members of the dominant caste Vallala. Intercaste marriages have also increased steadily during the armed conflict and repeated displacement. Moreover, some oppressed caste associations such as Vannar and Ambatar, Dobi and the Babas, with the support of the LTT, stopped their caste members visiting other caste houses in order to perform their customary rituals in life cycle ceremonies. It's called in Tamil Kudimai Tholil. Visiting other caste houses for such occupational purposes while violating the rules of these associations were deemed as punishable offense. The visible and collective resistance of oppressed caste against casteism during the pre-war Jaffna took multiple visible and invisible forms during the control of Tamil militancy, which include punishment, increasing number of intercaste marriages, and prevention of caste-based services undertaken in traditional manners. A resistance in contemporary Jaffna. The resistance of oppressed caste against casteism shifted from visible and collective acts to invisible individual acts in contemporary post-war Jaffna. The prolonged armed conflict and conflict-induced migration have also created an enforced structure of opportunity, which forced Tamil to move affluent foreign countries with asylum and refugee status. A substantial number of such oppressed caste and their relatives become empowered economically and ritually by accessing such transnational opportunities and networks. Their accumulated wealth in adaptive destination helped them to invest in rebuilding their caste-based temples, expanding their family assets, and upgrading their economic status in their homeland. Rebuilding the caste-marked temples, particularly the temples throughout the Jaffna, utilizing the overseas remittances rather than winning access to other caste temples, is interpreted in this study as an act of resistance through rituals. The mobilization and investment of oppressed caste in religious domain not only reshape the material development of their religious places, but also support their effort to live with dignity and respect, with a greater autonomy in the realm of caste ritual and religious rituals. Just this very practice of rebuilding and renovating temples throughout Jaffna Peninsula by different caste groups leads to the reproduction and consolidation of caste-based religious identities. Hence, the transnational economy of caste-based temples culture, along with the large scale of asylum migration of Tamils belonging to different caste groups, plays two opposite functions in contemporary Jaffna. These developments, however, do not entirely change the mindset of certain caste group as to whether the person from higher or lower caste backgrounds should access rituals of certain village-level caste-based temples. This shows continuous caste-based boundaries practiced in temples belonging to different caste groups. However, these attempts and achievement of different caste, particularly the underprivileged caste, in religious sphere and daily life are not necessarily for assimilating their identity like privileged caste Vallala, but this practice is done in order to upgrade their social, economic, religious standard and to enjoy what is perceived as moral superiority and social recognitions. Hence, there was a significant rise in construction of caste-funded temples in Peninsula, in which thinly distinguished message, the hidden message, easily read by the internal adversary, but less accessible to an outsider, was we have arrived, are bigger, better, and more devout than you. This message, as a form of invisible resistance, is systematically prevailing in everyday ritual life. Invisibility of resistance against caste domination is the most important difference in the subsistence of caste between pre-war and post-war Jaffna. The collective resistance of subordinate against visible caste domination in pre-war Jaffna was a public transcript similar to what Scott describes. Here, Scott particularly emphasized the hidden nature of these transcripts, where subordinate discourse is characterized as an act that takes place off stage and is not directly visible to public. However, the subordinate act of resistance against caste-based exclusion practiced in the Hindu ritual domain in contemporary Jaffna are not necessarily a performance of off stage. They are open to public visibility through the construction of undercaste temples and are equal to dominant caste temples throughout Jaffna. This process can be described as Vallalarization. I see the concept of Vallalarization as a range from adapting and imitating constructed custom habits and the rites of dominant Vallalas caste to pretending and identifying themselves as Vellala. The Scots' understanding of domination and the act of resistance through the lens of hidden transcript as an off-stage performance varies from invisible ritual mobilization of subordinate caste, because by this time they have been relatively empowered, are not subaltern due to the diaspora remittances. They are resistant in response to the historical as well as contemporary caste-based religious exclusion and segregation is quite visible throughout Jaffna, but not yet interpreted as such because it is non-confrontal and takes place in a relatively safe space of religious practice. The emergence of these temples and churches, I also would like to similar argument to the churches that there are caste-based churches as well in Jaffna, but not only Hindu temples, but churches as well. The emergence of these temples and churches is not based on need or accessibility, but is a self-conscious display of wealth and power, which in turn turns the upper caste by paying for and using their services. This phenomenon, in all its complexity and geographical nuances, is not a rejection of caste or caste-based identities, but merely a challenging the existing hierarchies. The competition is not, in this sense, an assertion of casteless equality, but only reinforce the essentialist notion of caste formation and maintenance. In fact, as the observance of religious rituals in these new temples demonstrate, caste roles are rigidly maintained and not transformed. Thus, there is even a segregation here because earlier in undercaste temple, the responsibility for performing rituals fell on the members of that caste groups. Whereas in the new dispersion, a Brahmin is paid handsomely to perform these rites. Hence, the attempt to support reproduction of caste differences in a class-based society, rather than being critical of caste-based inequalities and hierarchical status. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, sorry. Thank you so much, Thanges. I think that listening to Sinthujan speak and then understanding the significance and the erasure of caste history in the way that we understand Tamil history right now, and also asking extremely critical questions of ourselves as both academics and activists within this space to see what we're negating when we look at Tamil history, really pulls both of your speeches and your presentations very powerfully together, because we can understand what history of Ulam we've been taught, what history of Ulam we are teaching future generations, and what very important questions of caste and oppression we're missing from these conversations. Prior to continue speaking, I'd like to suggest for people that are wondering whether they'd like to submit questions, like I said earlier, for people that are joining right now, if you'd like to submit questions, please feel free to put either Sinthujan's initials or Thanges' initials prior to each question, or B for both. We did receive one question for both of the participants. Someone asked if they can give some specific ways in which Tamils in the diaspora continue to perpetuate casteist ideas. I was wondering if Sinthujan could start, and then we could have Thanges' answer as well. Sorry, Sinthujan, you're muted.
Sorry. I think one particular way of how the problem continues in diaspora is by way of negating it. I think a lot of times when we talk about what Tamilness means in diaspora, there's always these ways of essentializing Tamilness to certain aspects, to certain kind of like criteria of what we consider to be Tamil. And a lot of times it erases caste from that angle of analysis in a quite fatal, but I think also in a very like stupid way, because it really distorts the idea of how Tamil culture even became Tamil culture, and how many different parts of Tamil culture are part of caste cultures that are then reduced to be called Tamil culture. And I think in diaspora, we've ways of essentializing ourselves, but also of kind of creating a new kind of identity, which picks and chooses whatever is suitable to our likings and erases or pushes aside whatever doesn't suit our history or our narratives. And one example that I'm always curious about is when Tamil students form Tamil societies in universities, and they always have at Freshers Week at the beginning of university of the semester, they have a table set out to introduce Tamil society. There's always certain aspects of Tamil society that are presented, like the Tirukural or like the alphabet or different aspects, of Tamilness. And I'm always wondering, like, who decides what is, what becomes culture and what becomes representative for Tamil people and Tamil history. And oftentimes it becomes what Thanges called valorization, like the cultural items that Vellaras had accepted to be Tamil are the ones that we today name as Tamil. And I think that's something that we see in the production of Tamilness abroad as an ongoing kind of like stream where the interpretation and direction is always the ones dictated by Vellaras, and whatever doesn't suit that history and whatever doesn't suit that narrative is kicked out of it or silenced. And I think that's one of many ways of how abroad in exile people are continuing kind of like a very casteist practice.
Thank you. Thanges, would you like to add on to that?
Yes. In diaspora, there are lots of hidden conversation among family about caste and identity. But the obvious example I can give that the emergence of Ur association in Western countries. So what according to my data that I did research among Tamil, Jaffna Tamil in London, where all Ur associations are related to particular caste groups. Even in the same village, there are different Ur association. One is belonging to Vallala and other one is belonging to the other caste groups. So it's a kind of obvious development, reproduction of village Ur in dispersed Tamil diaspora localities, where they only interact with the particular caste group, and they have the annual festival, festival, where a large number of people are participating from particular caste groups. Even it can be either Vallala, so-called upper caste, or the oppressed caste. That's one. Other one is people from oppressed caste, they would like to hide their kind of conceal their identity rather than demonstrating their identity as Vallala do. The whole Ur association where the Vallala people celebrate this very massively and showing their Tamilness, but I don't see that sort of romanticized feeling among oppressed caste groups. Even they would like to hide their identity. Even they don't like to continue their caste-based occupation among diaspora localities. I can give a good example about the Ambata caste. They are from the Baba society. There are many groups, families are living in Western countries where they don't practice their caste-based occupation in diaspora, where they feel that if they continue that occupation, they can be easily identified or discriminated. It's a kind of reflection of that caste discrimination they would like to avoid, or they would like to prevent that occupation in order to doing that. And one pathetic thing is even those who are doing their a job like barbering job in a diaspora, and the same caste group would like to avoid the relationship with those who are doing the job, in order to show that they are not from that particular caste group, in a kind of moving towards Vallala identity. So it's a kind of the message that we can read, obviously. But these two examples, reproduction of Ur and concealing the identity, are really prevalent among Tamil society in all Western society. Thank you.
Thank you for mentioning that. I think that the understanding of how we reproduce it in the diaspora is way more nuanced than we think it is. And even like our Urondrakudals and the way that we run like an understanding, like both Sinthujan and Thanges touched on, the way we understand our literature and the way we understand our cultural gatherings, all contribute to casteist notions that we've taken over as both diaspora Tamils and as Tamils in the homeland. I think one question that we were getting a lot from mostly diaspora Tamils is how to understand this conversation with older generations. And someone was asking how to change or to alter the older generation's perspective on caste, even though it's so much entwined with their understanding of Tamil culture. And how do we change the narrative on this and have conversations with our parents and also our future children on the imposition of caste? Sinthujan, would you like to start?
I also had a point. Could I just add something else just before that? Based on what Thanges was saying, in terms of caste occupations and in diaspora, I think one of the points that I find very interesting is the role of the pare, the drum in current kind of conversations and current kind of practices in diaspora. And oftentimes you see the pare being flaunted at protests, at cultural events, at universities, in very, very different occasions where, and this has mainstreamed to the extent that people consider the pare, people means Velara people, consider the pare now to be a Tamil instrument. They call it the instrument of the kings, of Tamil kings, and they invite people to play that instrument and to mainstream it further and to accompany protests with that and to make it into a cultural item that is detached from its actual history. And just 100 years ago, when there was a case of a person who, a paria, from someone from the paria caste, who played that particular instrument and who are oppressed because of playing, like forced to play that instrument, but also oppressed for playing that instrument. When that person decided to play the pare for the funeral of another paria person, Vellalas attacked the group of people, and today, when we have conversations about the pare, it always erases every single aspect of that violent history and how that history and that art form that was developed out of that oppression has now been appropriated to the extent that Vellalar Tamils just pick it up, but also are able to pick it up without having to face repercussions of it. They will not be discriminated. They will not face the stigma. They will not evoke a history of violence and of stigma that someone from a Paria caste background will. A lot of people of Paria background leave that instrument, aside when they move abroad, when they flee abroad, because that is, as Thanges was saying, their way of trying to make a forcing a break into that history of oppression and these acts of discrimination. And I think that is where the privilege of Vellalas prevails, but also where their ignorance prevails, because whenever you start that conversation, especially with Tamil activists, you get a lot of ignorance, but actually also attacks. And I think that's what I find quite striking. A lot of people who, even people within my own friend circles, activist circles, who really fight for social justice and are very conscious and are very interested in a just society, they're the same people who support, but who are also silent towards groups within Tamil activist circles who propagate this instrument outside of its history, who erased the instrument's violence or the violence that was created and designed by the Vellalas against people who played that instrument. And I think that is one particular example that I find always returning, since 2009, we've seen that happen quite a lot in diaspora. And there's all different kinds of rhetorics of trying to negate that history or negate the violence within the practice. But I think it's something that people need to be more conscious about and need to actually look into more. In regards to the question that you actually asked, I think it's difficult to generally have these conversations with elderly Tamil. I think they're very important, and I think they're personal conversations that each single person has to have with their own family. I don't think the onus of labor should be on someone from an oppressed caste group to educate, elderly from a privileged background, but also the young from a privileged background. I think these are intimate discussions that are similar to how, white people have to talk to their parents about white supremacy, to how people from a privileged caste background should talk to their parents and should find ways of making them understand that the idiocy behind the system is harmful to everyone, including even to some degree people of privileged background, because it really limits the choices of how we interact with each other. It limits the choices of who we could be as a group, as a society. And I think I don't think there is a manual to that. I don't think there's a single way of doing that, but I think there needs to be, these are very personal conversations that need to happen within families, but that don't happen. They only happen, you know, like in most cases, they get reduced to, oh, I'm in love with this person, or I want to marry this person, but this person's from a different caste, can I marry this person? And then you see people just banalize the entire violence within the system, but also within this hierarchy, and silence it outside of these discussions. And it actually very rarely leads to a change within social behavior, because when we still look at, and I did a survey 8 years ago for my master's thesis with almost 1,000 participants, where I looked at also like marriage, kind of like marriage behavior of Tamils abroad, and you would see that still most marriages still happen within one particular caste group. You know, most marriages are not intercaste marriages, and even when they are love marriages, they happen within an already set up societal kind of like group, you know, a filtered group, that even the person that you love turns out to be with a very high likelihood to be from that very same caste as you are. So I think yeah, I will leave it at that.
Thanges, would you like to answer
Yeah,
this one?
I would like to continue what Sinthujan mentioned about the marriage practice, where we can see the conflict between older and younger generation. Particularly the marriage is the point where the conflict we can see simply. What is happening actually? The older generation is trying to maintain the caste identity and would like to their children to marry their own caste group. When I was doing the research on Ur Association in London, where one of the core reason why they are gathering, they said, we have to educate our younger children. That's the place where we gather together, our younger generation coming and participating in sports and cultural, festivals and participating in stage play. So this will create a space for them to find their future partner. So kind of the mentality they have. So that's and also we can simply focus that it's all purely caste, but caste is also subject to the condition, subject to the situation, where it's the education and economic wealth and all these play an important role and overturn the caste identity and purity. So there are lots of intercaste marriages I see among Tamils. As Sinthujan said, it's usually the arranged marriage taking place within the same caste group, but in course of time, there are many Tamils who are either silent or to talk about this as their younger generation moving forward and would like to marry people from out of their caste, even out of their ethnic groups. So it's kind of still they have kind of an attitude that their children should marry within their caste, but that is not always case. Even many intercaste marriages happening, even they are ready to accept. What is happening exactly? Once they have married, they married from different caste group. They also make some condition in order to have a cross caste kingship formation. That's prevailing particularly in Jaffna, but I think that might be the case among Tamil diaspora as well. So once they get married from, for example, say from the female from Vallala caste and the man from the Paraya caste. But in some cases, the Vallala caste people say that you should avoid your relationship with your parents. You have to avoid means, you should have less interaction, and you shouldn't interact with your group of people. Then if you go and interact, and if your people come to our place, then people identify to whom we married. So you should better to avoid that and become a Vallala. So there's a condition behind making the cross-caste kingship formation. So this condition again reinforce the caste identity rather than demolishing it. So it's like always shifting, demolishing, and again reproduction. So it's all playing together around caste issue. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think speaking to the cyclical nature of caste reproduction and understanding how much it's affecting and influencing the way that diaspora Tamils understand spaces that they congregate together, and how that form of oppression from a Vellalar oppression continues to replicate itself in the spaces that we create as diaspora Tamils is a notable point to make in terms of reinforcing how much those questions about personal conversations and the ways that you deconstruct caste are very personal. This forum and this presentation is here to present and to have the speakers speak on a historical and contemporary narrative of how caste has been erased from a Tamil historical discourse. And I really appreciate the comments that you've both been giving on understanding the nuances of how much our communities have continually perpetuated the Vellalar oppression that we've seen from the island in ways that we've often turned our eyes to. And also bringing the questions back to an Ulam context. Someone was wondering, in a post-war context, whether beyond the impact of remittances on religious institutions, how it intersects with resistance against or reinforcement of caste inequalities. Have diaspora remittances for the island have played any role in reinforcing or diminishing unequal economic livelihood opportunities between Vellalar and oppressed caste communities? And I know, Thanges, you touched on this in your presentation as well. Would you like to expand on that a bit?
Yes, that's a good question actually. But I'm not telling this is happening among entire oppressed caste group. I think oppressed caste access this infrastructure of opportunity of migrating affluent Western countries, but they are doing actually they are expanding their assets. For example, they have ability to buy land from the Vellala caste, the absentee landlords. I did the research in Pungudideva and Mallakam, where I see many oppressed caste people are buying the land from from Vellala, those who have already migrated overseas. So now they're building their shops, temples, and they're developing their assets, and they're economically much more empowered. It's happening among particular caste, particular oppressed caste groups. At the same time, there are a number of oppressed caste groups living in IDP camps. They are living in poverty. It's happening among another segment of society. But if we are talking in terms of remittance practice of oppressed caste, the remittance play a major role to bring this oppressed caste as a middle class society among in Jaffna. But if you go and talk to them, they will say that we are almost equal to Balala in terms of education, economy, and even we have our own temple. We have the ritual autonomy, and so on. But what is happening actually now? There is less participation of oppressed caste in Tamil politics. Even the diaspora Tamils particularly support the political party, those who came from the dominant caste Vellala. Even now, all major political parties are from dominant caste Vellala. But the oppressed caste really struggle to become into the mainstream politics. But they rarely get support from abroad actually. So they have less economical power in order to become a mainstream politics among Tamils. So that's the kind of core thing that we have to think about. And even they are talking about, that's the kind of space where we have to move forward. In all other aspects, I mean, education, economy, and rituals, we ourselves empowered rather than getting help from other people. We ourselves ready to empower. But to become a mainstream political, to take a mainstream political role, we have to think more, and for that there should be a progressive Tamil nationalism rather than Tamil nationalism always moving around the particular caste group. So that's the kind of thing that we have to think about.
Thank you, Thanges. Sinthujan, would you like to expand on that as well?
I think I'd leave it at Thanges' reply, and take on the next question.
That's great, because my next question is for you. Within your presentation, you mentioned about how caste matters within a genocide and an exodus, and you really discussed the existence of oppression against Tamil violence prior to the 58 programs as well, and also violent programs against, enacted by Vellalar dominant caste folk against lower caste people on the island. I was wondering if you could expand on how that influences our perception of loss during the genocide, and how that influences the way that we see the process of justice and accountability in Ulam today, and whether or not that loss plays a factor into understanding how we continue to see the struggle as it manifests today.
I think one aspect that I always find interesting is that who made it abroad, like who is sitting outside of the country and who's sitting inside of the country, or where did they make it, and depending on, caste is geography. And when you look at the settlements patterns and how a Tamil town or a Tamil village is constructed and designed, you can see how it is creating or enabling a sort of caste apartheid. And similar things also reflect in terms of so Tamil people relate to caste through geography, and relate to geography through caste. So when you think about even how people fled and who fled, you could see that these patterns also reflected those sentiments, but also the material and conditions of different people. Like the further you were able to flee, and the more affluent that country was, and also the more English speaking that country was, the more likely you would have a certain type of capital to mobilize. And oftentimes it overlaps with caste, like people who were able to go to America at a certain point before 83, for instance, come most likely from a dominant Vellalar caste, and similar things could be said about people who went to UK before 83, people who went to Australia before 83, but also in the waves of refugees that followed afterwards, the initial waves. And only the further the conflict prolonged, the more and more people were able to mobilize in different ways, but also through more difficult means, and I think one of the things that I always find interesting is that as Tamils who are politicized, we always talk about loss, but loss is so different to different people. For some people, loss is much more metaphorical, or more like a less material kind of reality than for other people. And a lot of times, like loss for people who come from more oppressed caste backgrounds, for instance, is much more material, than for people who come from privileged backgrounds. Like one example I could tell you, like from my own family background, for instance, like so I come from an intercaste marriage as well, and my mother's family, for instance, comes from a privileged background. And when you look at that family side, you see that most of the people, pretty much everyone, has fled the country. When I look at my father's side, for instance, who comes from an oppressed caste background, pretty much everyone is in the country. When I look at who joined the IRCAM, it was a similar pattern. People from my father's side joined the IRCAM to an extent that I didn't see anywhere in my mother's side, and I think these patterns of involvement in the liberation struggle, but also in actual facing losses beyond just having to flee, but actually having their homes destroyed, or having to be displaced, 20 times, 40 times, or whatsoever. I think you can see that there's an intersection in how caste really affected also the way of how people were vulnerable to state violence. And I don't think people really account that oftentimes. A lot of times, like, for instance, like I always wonder about the people who are disappeared, I always wonder about when we say things like the families of the disappeared, I wonder, like, who are these families? No one really asks the question of where do they come from, and what is their economic background, what is their social background, and why is it particular these people? But also, like, why is there only a type of support that they receive, and only from a certain type of people? And I think that is something that I find is under discussed in Tamil society. In a similar pattern, you could also see in terms of, I used to do a lot of asylum work in the UK, and a lot of times you could see that Tamil people are very much just invested into their own networks and into their own kith and kin, which literally means that they are interested more in their they're interested more in their caste networks, and in their immediate families, which means people were able to, people were willing to provide asylum aid to people who are like them. But once they have managed to secure the livelihoods of these people, they would not reach out and use those skills, those experiences to actually help other Tamil people. So the idea of solidarity is oftentimes very limited towards a particular community, and that is a caste community. It's the same way of how we talk about makkal and akkal. We use these words almost like as if they were synonyms, but they're not synonyms. Like they refer to very particular ideas of people. My people, or these people, or our people, in terms of, there's one word that is used in terms of relations to Sinhalese people or relations to white people, and there's one word that is in relation to Tamil caste groups. And I think when we look at all of these different aspects, we do get a very insightful kind of understanding of how deeply caste is involved in every single aspect of our lives, whether it's some that are not related to the conflict, but also many of them which are related to the conflict. And I think that is what I really see missing in conversations, especially by people in the diaspora actors. And there needs to be a lot more consciousness, and a lot more openness to talk about this, because I think by matter of most people being of privileged caste background, because our social pyramid is upside down, and upper caste make up a majority of our people. And they also end up being a majority of our people who are in the political activist scenes, It also leads to the fact that these people have blind spots that are not just blind spots, but that are actually reflective of a type of violence that is ongoing and continuing.
Thank you so much. I think it's very important to highlight just how much we perceive our loss to this day, and whose loss we're categorizing. And I really appreciated you using both a personal history and your academic history to tie together exactly how the oppressor caste has been able to dominate the narrative of what loss looks like, and what questions we're forgetting to ask, or purposely ignoring to ask, when it comes to understanding the parameters around loss and the way that we understand it following genocide, and how that affects those that remain back in the island, which are usually from the oppressed caste. Thanges, would you like to add anything to that?
I don't have a specific comment, but I can say one thing about Sinthujan touched about who migrated and what social background they have, and when the oppressed caste became part of diaspora. That's a very, very interesting point. I just want to mention, but since 1990s, we can see there are lots of Wallalas, those who have the social capital, and somehow to flee the country in order to escape the hardship of war. But what has happened actually after the 1990s, there are lots of oppressed caste group also migrating. The tremendous number of numbers among Tamils, those who migrated, are from the Wallala caste group. So in 1950s in Jaffna, there was a survey done by Michael Banks. He said that there are 50% of the population from Wallala caste. When I did my research in 2015, I collected data from 2 different places where I found that approximately 25% of these populations are from the Wallalas. So what has happened to all other members in Jaffna? If you really see it, there are lots of Wallala have migrated overseas. So this also and also when the oppressed caste also migrated overseas, but still they have lots of their own relatives living back home, as Sinthujan mentioned his father's relatives. So what has happened actually, this has created a geographical, it's actually break the geographical boundaries. If the Wallala have been living in the same places historically, and if there's no interruption due to without war, then of course they have the monopoly over the land. What has happened now, actually, there are lots of oppressed caste groups are able to buy lands. Even Pungudidi, where I did my research, now many Ballalas are living, many oppressed caste are living in Ballala's house. They are willing to buy lands. Even the absentee landlords, those who are living abroad, then they are willing to sell the land because they feel that they are not going back. Their children are going back. So why we should have the land? So they are selling the land. So this kind of indirect results of war and displacement also kind of created some opportunity for the oppressed caste group to access the land in Jaffna, as they are living predominantly and numerically they are high at the moment. But at the same time, they are unable to, even though they are numerically high, according to my research, I see these 5 oppressed caste groups collectively, comprise over 50% of the populations. But when we see about those who are going to parliament, the member of parliament, there is none of the members are from the oppressed caste group. What they see that the struggle for the oppressed caste is now not for the social. Of course, there's a lots of issue in ritual and economy and access to many social capital, but at the same time, they see it's very important for them to access the politics, Tamil politics. They still feel they are passive to the Tamil mainstream politics. So that's very important thing that I have to raise. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that understanding the current caste politics on the island as well, and how it translates into representation of oppressor castes and oppressed castes is very important in understanding it from a perspective that has been privileged for several generations in its ability to ignore caste for a very long time. So both of your nuanced analysis of looking at caste as it applies to our perception of the struggle and our perception of both loss, representation, and resistance on the island are very, very powerful comments that would stick with us for a very long time. So thank you for that. We had a couple of questions also on the religious aspects of caste in Ulam right now. Someone mentioned that in Nallur, there was a recent ban on the sale of beef, and animal sacrifices practiced by some Hindus have been banned across the island. How much of this is related to caste, and how much is caste purity associated with being vegetarian on the island? Sinthujan, would you like to start off?
Sure. I think all of it is related to caste. I don't think it's something that can be erased or de-linked from caste. I think these attempts of kind of like what Thanges called valorization are also like just in the chain of, in the hierarchy of a Sanskritization process, of achieving a kind of like a Brahmanization, a Brahmin kind of customs, and making them the common customs and the dominant customs within Tamil society. And we've seen that these trends, like take place abroad, but also back home, and I think these bans are very common, and they oftentimes target, or they mostly target, like people from oppressed caste groups, because nutrition has always been something that has been dictated by caste, because nutrition has been dictated by labor. Like the types of food that you had to eat and were able to purchase and afford were all related to what your caste occupation was and what your position within that social hierarchy is. And I think the idea of Tamil people, like Saiva people, being vegetarian is a form of kind of like achieving a kind of like ritual purity that they see within a Brahmanical kind of like customary rules, And I think these reforms and these impositions have taken place in the 19th century already, when the reforms by Adamuha were put in place, there were similar kind of like attempts to purify Tamil society, which means to render it into something that actually oppresses and oppressed caste members, and their cultures. And that's something we've seen happening over the centuries, and it still is an ongoing process, and that process doesn't stop, back home. That's why I'm always interested, or I always have a vested interest in talking about kotti roti, and kotti roti's history, and how when we look at kotti roti in Tamil restaurants back home or here, you hardly find beef kotti roti anymore. You'll find everything but beef kotti roti, and people are like, oh, mutton is the best one, or chicken is the best one, or veggie or seafood. But where's the beef? Beef was the original kotti roti, but it was purified. It was erased from the menus. It was erased from Tamil consciousness. And kotti roti was sold by Tamil Muslims, like across Jaffna for a very long time as a street food, a cheap street food that then Hindu boys, drunk Hindu boys would eat secretly without telling their parents, and that was a very common thing. And when we think about kotti roti today, we don't think about beef kotti roti. We ask ourselves, where is that beef? We also don't think about beef curry, as being a staple item, within Tamil cuisine. And that's something that, as I was saying before, is a reflection of Vellalar supremacy, in the sense that Vellalars are the ones to decide the course of what Tamil society and what Tamil culture has to go. They are the ones to decide what custom should be held on and what custom needs to be like oppressed or erased from the map. And that also means like the custom of course don't live just as customs. The customs are attached to cultures, to people. So that also means like the erasure of our people. And I think a lot of times these things happen in Jaffna, like in mainland peninsula Jaffna, which and then like impose themselves on other parts, but also reduce themselves to what is maybe in a place like Manipur, relevant, and then render themselves relevant for everyone else, while erasing so many different pluralities and complexities of what Tamil culture, cuisine, and history is and was. And I think the current discussion, or also like the impositions of bans, need to be looked at from an analysis of caste, but also need to be looked at into an analysis of how like cyber fundamentalism is taking so much space in Jaffna and other places back home, and how much of it is also influenced by the BJP in India, and how these linkages are growing, how Indian influence is shaping also of what we consider to be our indigenous religions, and the same thing happens here as well. When you think about the customs that we today celebrate here, like cyber, like suddenly Deepavali is a thing, suddenly like all kinds of like customs that we see from northern Indians or other parts of India become Tamil customs too. And this is, I think, the way, of course, culture is never static, but there's also like power dynamics within culture that are privileging some while oppressing others, and that are that need to be considered from a critical viewpoint.
Thank you, Sinthujan. Thanges, would you like to add on to that?
But most of the point that I wanted to say, but Sinthujan has told. But I can say that there, the beef, eating beef. It's I saw when I was in Jaffna. Even Vallala ate beef and oppressed caste ate beef, and Vallala they are practicing kind of they are pure vegetarian. Even those people who came from the oppressed caste also pure vegetarian. So there are the food is the kind of there are kind of traditional notion. Those who are eating beef and dead animal were belonging to the particular caste group. But if you really do a research, and if you really understand what's going on among society, there are kind of hidden practice among people from all caste groups. They hide themselves and eat beef, and all things are happening. Even the dominant caste Vallala avoid eating food from the oppressed caste, but they are willing to drink toddy from their home. So it's a high. These all nuances are important to understand in this conversation, I think. But apart from that, Sinthujan has touched many things. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that from my understanding of the ways that both of your answers correlate with each other, it's understanding like how Vellalars have had the power and the privilege for so long to decide which customs, especially like just repeating what you said, Sinthujan, honestly, which customs you hold on to and which customs you can like sneakily use at a certain time, but also erase over time. I mean, like just from like a personal note, the discussion of kotroti itself got me wondering what types of food have been intentionally erased in the process of migration and the process of understanding also the length and depth of history of Ulam food in Ulam as well. So that's a very important reflection. And also something that you touched on was how a lot of our discussions of food and the history of food that we talk about is very like Jaffna centric. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on how the nature of caste conversations can be very Jaffna centric. Dynamics are different in Matakalapu and Batiklo and like in the periphery, as you stated in your presentation. I was wondering if you could just expand on why we have this Jaffna centric notion of caste and how to understand it from outside of that center.
I think, I mean, when we look at, like how migrations happened into the island, I think we could start off as that. And we always start off with the Jaffna Kingdom, it's like what people always talk about and always want to relate to when they want to talk about Tamil autonomy or self-rule, And I think because Jaffna has been a cultural hub, and has had a majority population that was Tamil, and produced a lot of, and also had its closest linkages, like to what is now Tamil Nadu, I think it has always has a very central point in production of what is now considered Tamil, and I think Jaffna in itself, because of the ways of how caste is policed in Jaffna and imposed in Jaffna, it's the most strictest type of way of doing that, within the whole Tamil spectrum of Tamil lives in the island. And therefore Jaffna always had this viewpoint of being, or people from Jaffna always had this viewpoint of being kind of like the purest, the highest, the most powerful ones on to decide, like what is a worthy Tamil kind of like culture, or what is a worthy way of living as a Tamil, people in Jaffna have always looked at the rest of the country as the periphery. I remember like from a lot of conversations that people were like, their world ended after like when the Vanni started, their world ended, it was like that big jungle for them in their heads. That was just out of their minds and out of their sights, and I think a lot of, and the same with people on the Tivu, like for a lot of mainland like Jaffna people, like their idea of what a Tamil place has been very limited, and that is not very unusual, because that's how it mostly, like happens in most places, before there's some form of globalization happening, or a local globalization happening. And I think the Jaffna centrism is a result of different kind of historical kind of like developments, but also of demographics. And I think demographics and also the way of how Jaffna in itself has been a peninsula, and because of the Elephant Pass being such a small, a tiny little piece of strip of land that detached itself from the rest of the island, it was quite self-contained in that sense, except for, like relationships, with the sea and other places. And it was able to hold on to or produce a type of culture that was also in a different type of way in exchange with the rest of the country, or what is now the country. And I think Jaffna centrism is something that has haunted us since like historically for a very long time, and in the present as well. It is because Colombo centrism, when we talk about Colombo Tamils, for instance, is also Jaffna centrism, because Colombo Tamils mostly are from Jaffna. They've lived in Colombo during the colonial period or after, have shifted, like it's the Jaffna bourgeoisie that maybe lived in close to Nallur, in Manipa and other places, that has then shifted to London, and lives now somewhere in Wembley or in Harrow on the Hill or somewhere else. Like you've got all these kind of like very historic relations to these places. The same with Trinco. Trinco also has a very huge population that origins or considers itself to be originating from Jaffna, and therefore a lot of times the kind of politics that are practiced and the kind of like representation that we get always comes from Jaffna. It doesn't think of the rest of the country. It doesn't think about the kind of like pluralities and existences that are outside of Jaffna. And it also feels threatened by them. That's why I think a lot of the times we have discussions of people from the north being so much in disregard of people from the east, or people from the Vanni or from Mannar or other places, because a lot of times they're unable to trace these people, to place them, you know, like it's, for instance, one of the things that I always found interesting as a child, for instance, I always had to lie about the question of, when we ask the question of where are you from, you know, it always means like, what is your ur, what is your caste, you know, and all these kind of like denominators. And I always had to lie about where we are from. I always had to say like Nigombo, because Nigombo was out of reach for people. And Nigombo was something they couldn't place in a caste map. They couldn't put a spot on it. It could be anything, but it could also be nothing. And I think a lot of times Tamil people from Jaffna particularly have an issue when they cannot place someone, you know, and that's why these places and people from these places are threatening to whatever they want to hold on to, a very rigid, conservative, orthodox, patriarchal and violent form of culture.
Thank you, Sinthujan. Thanges, would you like to continue with that?
Yes, when it comes to caste, why we are particularly talking about Jaffna Tamils and Jaffna centric, but it's very important that we can see that Jaffna is traditionally known as a very, very conservative society in terms of caste, and it's also and also we have to understand the resistance also came from Jaffna. Many caste activists from since 1920s, the Tamil Youth Congress and Tamil Minority Mahasabha. So all activism came from Jaffna as well. So people have started to fight against casteism in Jaffna. So that's maybe one reason why we all are talking about caste in Jaffna. And also there are other places where Tamils living are kind of multicultural society. Even if you go to Trincomalee, Batticaloa, Ampara, and even Vavuniya, even Mannar, where you can see the interaction with other groups like the Muslim, Sinhalese are much more prevalent than Jaffna. Jaffna, even since 2000, I didn't move out of Jaffna because I was in Jaffna. So all people know each other's Tamil. Even LTT has expelled Muslim from Jaffna, and after that we don't have any other group. Actually, we only Tamil were living. So it's a kind of fundamental society, conservative society, very orthodox society where the caste is still prevailing, but at the same time the struggle against casteism also came from Jaffna. So it's very important geographical area where we should talk about caste, but it doesn't mean that in other district, in other Tamil district, there's no caste, but there are castes, but they are much more progressive than Jaffna. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that understanding just how deeply personal your caste identification was from a very young age, especially belonging to an oppressed caste and having to navigate spaces where you were forcibly told to express where you're from or what oud you're from, and then understanding just how that influences the narratives that we adopt when we speak of caste and we speak of caste liberation are extremely important in understanding how a lot of times our Jaffna-centric lens of understanding caste is just repeating exactly what Sinthujan and Thanges said, are very violent and destructive in a way that negates several identities that are oppressed and continue to have this sort of cyclical oppression. We had a question on the reconstruction of caste-based religious structures as a form of resistance and reclamation, while also reinforcing caste hierarchies. Do you find that movements toward caste abolition has weakened since the end of armed conflict? And due to the focus of Tamil ethnic identity as under threat, I know that both Sinthujan and Thanges, you mentioned this idea of unity and how that idea of unity itself has been oppressive in a way that erases oppressed castes' contributions and histories within the struggle? And do you find that this movement toward understanding the complete Tamil ethnic identity under threat has negated caste and understanding what caste abolition is for some time? Sinthujan, would you like to start?
Yeah, definitely. I think it did undermine and it still undermines. And I think you can see the dynamics that is the result of that in terms of like whenever you evoke the question of caste, you know, in any type of Tamil kind of political or social setup, you always get accusations of being a traitor, of being someone who wants to separate Tamils, you know, or who works for the Sri Lankan intelligence or the Indian intelligence, or someone, you know, who has vested interest in actually like harming Tamils rather than actually supporting or helping Tamils, you know. And I think that type of rhetoric and that type of ways of undermining like discussions about caste have in many ways been the result of the ethnic conflict, you know. In many ways it subsumed the question of caste and made it kind of like irrelevant or secondary or tertiary. And I think a lot of times people are like, let's wait for this, let's wait this out. Like any type of oppression, intra-societal oppression, they're like, let's wait it out. We have a bigger question to answer before we can reach that point, you know. It never had that intersectional approach to say like, we need to talk about all of these things because they all matter. And I think it's still the case, you know. Like, I mean, things have changed like quite a lot in terms of like, even the fact that we have discussions like these today is quite different, you know. Like 10 years ago when I did more public kind of like work on caste, the climate was very different, you know, and the reactions of people were very, very different. Like I had all types of kind of slander to harassments to face, you know, because of it. And I think today there's still this type of violence still exists, but I think there's much more space. And I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that, for instance, like when we have this discussion in diaspora, that we've moved on in age. Like 10 years ago, the people, the type of conversations that I could have, very limited, because a lot of the people who I was talking to were not in an age of marriage, or were just reaching an age of marriage, you know, and their experiences, because they're mostly from a privileged background, was never to actually like be confronted with caste, unless they then ended up in a setup of where their friends, their family members, or they themselves, you know, like someone they heard of facing issues because of a marriage. And that in a way also created a type of limited or conditional sensitivity and consciousness that in some ways helped, I think. I don't think in all ways, but I think in some ways there's a way of how this might have opened up the eyes of some people that actually there's something that still functions, that is that needs to be talked about. And but I think generally speaking, the ways of how we hierarchize oppression has harmed, you know, the questions of caste, because caste is the foundation, I think, of all questions in terms of our society. It's questions of gender are always questions of caste as well. Oftentimes we undermine discussions on the liberation of Tamil women by not talking about how, you know, oppressed women, you know, have faced both, you know, the brunt of patriarchy and caste, you know, and how queer people have faced so many other kind of like intersections of oppressions as well. And I think that's something that very, very rarely gets discussed about. You know, very few people want to talk about who are these, you know, like particular people, and why are their lives the way they are, and why are our lives the way they are. And I think for like when we did a talk a few years ago in Switzerland with Sagi and Tafs in Zurich, you know, it was quite interesting. There was like, I don't know, probably around 200 something students, you know, and I always go into these rooms with the idea like, well, I'm probably not going to change anyone except for one single person who might have had an idea or might have developed a sort of kind of consciousness or criticalness towards that issue. And that's already good, you know, because most people don't necessarily go into a room and walk out of it with convinced of a different idea. You know, they mostly walk into that room with a particular mindset and walk out with that same mindset, you know. And back then dynamics were also quite interesting, you know, like there was a person who was introducing me who was talking about how bad caste is, you know, and everything. And then at the end of my talk, she was like, I still don't believe caste is a real thing or is relevant today. And I was like, that's amazing. That's just amazing. And like to prepare for this research, I was reading a statement by Selvarajah where he was saying, he was sensitive towards caste to some degree. You know, he was not like, you know, like the All Sloan Tamil Congress, you know, he didn't dismiss it, but he said like oppressed caste feel like they are being discriminated. And I'm like, they feel like they're being discriminated? That's amazing. You know, like the words and the kind of like slight ways of kind of like dismissing their concerns and their violations is something that I think is an ongoing kind of discussion, you know, and I think we don't have enough spaces for that. You know, like we get hijacked by discussions about colorism, we get hijacked by discussions about anti-blackness or this and that, you know, but we don't interlink them with how they're related to caste. Or we do it in a very, very kind of like dropping names kind of way, you know, like where we just like add on all these isms and think that we've done the labor, but we actually haven't, because people very, very rarely dwell in like deeper into the issue and very rarely actually want to understand what this is, and by understanding what this is, who you are within that system.
Thank you, Sinthujan. Thanges, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to follow the contemporary understanding of many people, even my friends. When I actually received the poster from Pearl, I posted in my Facebook. Then I received a message from my friend. He studied as a senior in University of Peradeniya. He said, change the topic, Machan. Right to think differently, like innovative. The world is running very fast. Caste is not an issue nowadays. The poverty, vulnerability, disaster, land encroaches, displacements, resettlement, and cultural challenges are real issue now. Please change. So that's a kind of, the mentality among the majority of Tamils who don't like to talk about caste. But the thing is, you know, but they believe that if we don't talk about caste, that caste will disappear. But that doesn't work anyway. So I would like to answer the one particular question you asked about this temple and temple renovation project have two different functions. One is it's giving kind of ritual autonomy, ritual empowerment among oppressed caste group. At the same time, the temple itself become caste identity. So how that kind of reinforcing the caste identity, where the oppressed caste members were had the power to perform the rituals and puja in their caste temple. After building the temple from non-agamic to agamic tradition, then they are bringing the Brahmins into their temple and perform the ritual. Now they are reproducing that hierarchy in temples and surrounding that place. So that's a kind of understanding. What is seen that the temple entry movement in 1960s had a kind of symbolic success. It actually, the major temples in Jaffna after the struggle opened for the oppressed caste group, they are able to enter. But in order to have equal access to the rituals, they can't have it as it's completely controlled by the so-called upper caste, Vallala and Brahmins. So it's a kind of property of particular caste group, a property of particular family. So they have the success to enter, but when they think about the equal access to temple puja, then they don't have. So only way that they can have that access if they build their own temple. So if they bring the Brahmins to their temple. So this is a kind of, if we deeply understand what's going on, that all the temples in Jaffna, in all Jaffna Peninsula are particularly the property of particular family and caste group. So it's a, so that's the one reason the oppressed caste willing to develop their own temple rather than willing to access to other caste temples. So it's a kind of even though we see there are lots of development taking place, the temples are built, and those who are looking from outside, it's see outside, people have enjoying their rituals, but actually it's a kind of caste is playing very crucial role in reinforcing that identity in a modern society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that a lot of our conversations on understanding how caste has been reinforced in ways that are eroded in our conversations on unity have been offered an extreme level of nuance by both Sinthujan and Thanges. Thank you so much. I feel that in the questions that a lot of people were asking, we're gaining a lot of influence and knowledge on what our understanding of the oppression of the caste system looks like, both within an ILM context, diaspora context, and within that migration as well. We have one last question, and I'm sorry to everyone, we're going a little bit over time, but to end off on our questions, we had someone submit a question on the particularity of the public conversations that you've had, and I know Sinthujan, you touched on this in a talk you've delivered in the diaspora a couple of years back, but we were wondering about your experience navigating public conversations about caste amongst educational establishments and the media in the homeland. Thanges, would you like to go first, and then we'll have Sinthujan go next?
Yes. So I always believe that the academics should work through the activist point of view rather than being purely academics in university and delivering lectures. So while I was doing my research in Jaffna, I keep writing about caste and caste discrimination and how people are discriminated in society, both in Tamil and English languages. So when I wrote an article about need for a progressive Tamil nationalism and participation of oppressed caste in Tamil politics, so this article reached a lot of people actually. After I wrote that article in Tamil language, it came in Thinakural and two different Tamil newspaper in Jaffna. People have started to find who is this person and where he came from. Then there are many activists, those who are from the oppressed caste background, and found me and called me. Then they have told me, then our political aspiration is something different. We have to develop our own society. Tamil politics, always thinking about Tamil nationalism and identity, but actually we are losing everything due to their aspiration. So we have lots of other development. We need to develop our people, our education, our infrastructure, and many other things we have to go forward. So for that, we are unable to depend on our own politician. So we have to have our own politics in order to empower our community. So then they have started to mobilize towards establishing a political party. So I was a member in that meeting. We have a meeting. I was there for last 1 year. Then during 2015, we had the conversation and meetings between different groups of people came from the oppressed caste background. I think now they formed a political party, it seems, Tamil Makkal Munneta Kalagam or something, but I forget the name. So what I'm telling that we can work with the people while we are working on caste, actually. So it's a caste is not a kind of abstract subject. It's a kind of very realistic and a subject which always work with people and empower people. There are lots of space for that in current politics in Jaffna. So what according to my understanding and my experience, what I understand, there are lots of people from oppressed caste background willing to genuinely develop their own society. So for that, there is a space for that. So for that, we all have to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Thanges. Sinthujan, would you like to answer the question as well?
I think within educational institutions, a lot of the work, at least outside of the island, like caste work is first of all very often Indian-centric, and a lot of it is also being done by people of privileged caste background or white people. And the same goes for a lot of the discussions, that relate to Tamil kind of caste questions. There's a lot of also Sinhalese people who do it, which is also interesting. But the question is like, who is able to produce knowledge, and whose knowledge is being accepted, who is within the institutions, and who is able to kind of like direct the discourse. And I think a lot of times when people who are in any type of, like relation, concerned by a question, whenever they produce knowledge, it's always dismissed very quickly and very easily. Like one of the things that I always find out is like, when I put out the first articles in online like newspapers and stuff for my master's like survey and stuff, there's like the first question that came from almost every other Tamil person was like, who is this person and why? And of course that question is quite different in this particular setup, because you know exactly what they're trying to achieve, and if I would have, for instance, just been Vellalar, it would have just worked very differently. It'd be like, there'd be trust, there'd be a kind of like kinship. There wouldn't be like that, oh, this person is maybe like working to undermine our society from underneath, this person is maybe not going to sell us out, this person has interest because this person is like us, and I think those kind of stakes are very real still in academia. Like, I'm not working academically on this subject at all at the moment, and but I'm still very curious to always like observe the kind of dynamics. And we, like, I work a lot with Tenmuli, who's also like an activist, like a Dalit activist, Tamil one from Tamil Nadu, but in the US. And we try to do a lot of like cross kind of like relational kind of like work, and also like kind of solidarity work in both different spaces, but to also make sure that, like people like Dalits, especially, or people of oppressed caste backgrounds, are involved in leading these kind of like knowledge productions, are leading or are shaping and coining the terms, the vocabularies, like the directions of these conversations. And that's something that still needs to be established. And I think in a lot of institutions, there is not enough consciousness, towards the issue. When I was still living in the UK, I was observing, like, from a more journalistic point of view, the anti-caste struggle, the struggle to include caste into the equality kind of like laws, legislation, as a way of making caste legally of being legally able to challenge caste discrimination, and we think about these different aspects of how difficult it is to actually like describe and include something like casteism as a real, like, harming, violent form of oppression into different legislations and institutions. We still struggle, with these things back home. Like, for instance, back home, there was never an idea of, as in India, there's no way of doing affirmative action. There are no quotas. There's no way of uplifting people through structural means, in the same ways as, for instance, India is doing it. India is not doing it great, of course, but it's at least, like a way of starting, like to do right what has been done wrong for so many years. And similarly, I think here within institutions, there's very little consciousness of these dynamics, these dynamics within a community, these dynamics within different groups, and I think an interesting kind of aspect that I always think about is, how in the UK, in London, Tamil students were very vehement in founding their own Tamil societies instead of being grouped in a Sri Lankan society, but I'm always wondering, like, is a Tamil society, for instance, could it be a safe space for people, like from oppressed caste groups, if these people actually want to kind of practice these politics of abolishing the caste system, of challenging the culture that a lot of, like, privileged caste people uphold, and by upholding them proudly and romantically, they also uphold the casteist kind of like structures that create them. And I think that's something that we still struggle with, and that's something that still needs to be talked about, because, as Thanges was saying, a lot of people who come from oppressed caste backgrounds don't say that they are. They don't want to be, put on the spot. They don't want to be exposed and discriminated. They don't want to face the sanctions that are very real and that are also very contemporary. So therefore, it is, for instance, in our interest to create a society where everyone is able to name themselves, not necessarily because we believe in the system, but because we believe that the system has created material conditions that have harmed people, still continue to harm people, and still affect people, both people from oppressed backgrounds, but also from privileged backgrounds. And I think that is something that we need to aspire to as a society.
Thank you so much. I feel like that is an incredible way to end off our presentation for today by thanking both of our guest speakers as well. Sinthujan and Thanges, the amount of clarity and depth and knowledge that you've brought to this conversation today has truly been a knowledgeable and wonderful experience. Thank you so much for sitting with us and for walking us through your research background and your professional background and your understanding of just how caste oppression has existed within the Tamil struggle to an extent to which we haven't incorporated it in these spaces. And I find that in curating and hearing from both of you in terms of the nuances of the caste struggle and understanding just how, repeating Thanges' velarization term has come to dominate the ways in which we understand loss and the ways we build spaces that are not necessarily safe for those that belong to an oppressed caste, inform the ways in which we mobilize and inform the ways in which we go about learning and educating ourselves and our communities on what caste oppression truly, how it's truly manifested over time in our history. For both of you guys, there's a lot of really positive comments that people are putting in the comments below. So that's been, I would say it's been really nice to read through. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to mention that there were a lot of questions posed to both Sinthujan and Thanges throughout the presentation. We've included their Instagram handle, Sinthujan's Instagram handle. We've also included some contact points for Thanges as well. However, prior to contacting them with your questions, please be mindful of the fact that both Sinthujan and Thanges have been studying this for a very long time. Their hard work and their labor is something that we need to be respectful of and understanding of when we write out questions to them. So questions such as, like we discussed earlier, an understanding of like your personal relationship with caste or your familiar relationship with caste is more, like Sinthujan repeated, a personal decision and a personal conversation that you were to have. But questions that you are framing to both of our guest speakers today in a conversation outside of this space, please be mindful of their educational background and the amount of work and labor that they've been putting into for these presentations and presenting to us about, especially when it concerns a topic that is so deeply personal and so ingrained in part of our identity as well. I'd also like to note that people who had questions about resources, we have released a reading list prior to this call, and there are several readings, if you Google both Thanges' name and Sinthujan's name, that they've written extensively on caste as well. So I'd like to end by further repeating that our session is recorded and it will be available on YouTube. For people that are interested in more sessions like this, as I could tell a lot were, please consider donating to Pearl. We value these spaces that we're able to create, but just like we mentioned earlier, the labor and hard work that both Sinthujan and Thanges have put into the important analysis and context that they've given us during this presentation must be compensated, and the work of a lot of activists and academics in the space must be compensated as well. So please consider donating to Pearl. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Sinthujan and Thanges. I hope you have a wonderful day or evening, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thank you. Bye.